to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 28th day of July in the year 2015, and of course, as you are aware, we are beginning our program, as we usually do on Tuesdays, 30 minutes later than we begin our programs on Monday and Wednesday. And again, the explanation for the shorter program on Tuesday is that we have a regular program that is broadcast on the Head On Radio Network that begins at 3 p.m. So bottom line is, whatever time we start, we got to leave by 3. And so that means that our Tuesday programs are abbreviated 90-minute programs rather than the full 2 hours that we have on Monday and Wednesday. Barring that, though, I think everything else is as it should be. In the midst of our week of broadcasts, this is the middle day of a three-day broadcast schedule. Today was a little bit, for me, it was a little bit easier since we were, in the midst of a topic which we weren't able to complete yesterday, but hopefully we'll be able to get through the bulk of it today. And these are the collection of documents recently released under the Freedom of Information Act as the result of suits brought by the Union of Concerned Scientists dealing with the issue of climate change, but more specifically, efforts by those embedded in the industry to confuse the general public with misinformation and outright disinformation related to the climate change issue. And again, we've been talking about this off and on now for some time, and I don't want to take a whole lot of our program today in terms of review, but I think it is very important to keep in mind the psychology of this particular issue. And what I mean by that is, it is not necessary to disprove the science that is warning us of what is happening to the climate, to what is happening to the planet, and the extent to which human behavior is contributing to that, is actually causing it. That was the gist of the Pope's encyclical, you'll recall. Hard science is generally reinforcing that. For those who have a vested interest in denying the science, it's important to recognize that they do not have to counter the science with contradictory evidence. They don't have to refute the science. All they need to do is create enough controversy and enough confusion that the general public and the media, of course, which is all part of it, become confused and not sure. And once you get across the idea that there are two competing positions on this, and it's impossible to tell which one's right and which one's wrong, and therefore the only thing we can do is air both of them and suggest that the choice is up to the listener or to the student or to the general public to decide which way they want to go. The implication is that one direction is as legitimate as the other, when in fact it's important to keep in mind and constantly recognize that that indeed is not true. That's the goal of the campaign, is not to refute the other side, but merely to raise enough doubt and create enough controversy to confuse the general public. I think that's the issue that we really need to constantly keep in mind, because it reminds me of these television programs, these hour dramas. I'm thinking of Jessica Fletcher and Matlock and many of the others, where if you watch the role of these defense attorneys, it's not necessary, in Matlock's case, for example, to find the person who committed the crime. Usually, the way the program falls into place, Matlock's job is to create enough doubt that his client did the job in order to get a favorable verdict from the jury. In other words, the jury's conclusion is we do not have enough hard and fast evidence to prove this person's guilt, so therefore we have to let them go. That's all Matlock wants, is not necessarily to solve the crime as much as it is to defend his client from being found guilty for that particular crime. It's the same kind of thing. It's not going 180 degrees from one position all the way over to another one. It's just taking the issue far enough in the other direction that you raise doubt and you create controversy and you cause, a split vote, so to speak. And as we know in our jury system, a split vote on a jury means that the accused is innocent, and that's really all that that the issue requires. And that's kind of where we are in this particular issue. We have a few more documents that in this group that has been released under the Freedom of Information Act, because I don't think that there's any substitute for looking at the evidence and actually getting our hands on the hard evidence in order to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that there is a concerted effort to disinform or misinform the general public and the media in this whole effort. I think it is very important. I think once we look at that evidence, I think that it's pretty much easier for all of us to reach a conclusion on the particular issue that we're more comfortable with. And I want to, assuming we get done in time, I'd like to speculate on a few conclusions or a few possible ways to kind of bring all of these issues together and make some sense out of them. We do welcome your participation in our program, and as I mention each day, I try to remember to mention, we have a phone number. We would love for you to raise your questions or your concerns, your comments, your suggestions, whatever, related to these issues. I know that I would love to hear them, and I know that our other listeners would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And again, a reminder that 4676 translates on your keypad into HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate your thoughts directly to me via email, if you have issues about going on the air yourself, then by all means, the most important thing is to get your thoughts and your ideas and your comments out there. And if you send them to me in an email, I'll become the vehicle that brings these to the rest of our audience, if you would prefer that I do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, that's all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And then finally, you have an opportunity to make yourself heard on these issues on Facebook. For the last couple of weeks, we've had a Facebook page for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and if you go to Facebook and you type in Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to it. And over the first 2 weeks, I've posted 4 or 5, I believe, pieces, articles that I've written or blogs that I've written. I don't know whether you can officially call this a blog or not, but position papers that I've written based on some of the programs that we've recently done. There's one that I put on the on the Facebook page just prior to the weekend at the end of last week on the Greek credit issue. And then the one before that dealt with Jefferson. I put a piece there which really took us through Jefferson's General Diffusion of Knowledge document on universal education in post-1776 Virginia. And then I followed that up a couple of days later after I saw some of the comments from people who read that on Facebook. I followed that up 2 or 3 days later with a general essay on what I believed the issues related to Jefferson's position on education amounted to in today's world. And that's really the way I'd like to make use of this Facebook page.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Yes, Bob.
Hate to interrupt, but you've got John on the line from out west on the road somewhere, and he's got some questions for you.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you, Bob.
Let's go to him now. Go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm doing a headset thing, so if the quality is not as good as it could be, I apologize.
That's fine.
I'm kind of, see how I can say this and say it properly. Maybe it's me, but I'm detecting a theme here that seems to kind of run through these last week or two of your conversations.
Okay.
And it kind of finally poked me in the butt enough to make me want to call.
I'm sure glad you did.
Would you not think that there is a set of competing means here of an ownership class of people that, like, for instance, with the whole Greek situation, I mean, I can't get out, and for brevity's sake, I'm not going to try to get into it. I'm going to gamble that you know a little bit about things like fractional reserve banking and stuff like that.
Don't gamble a whole lot of money.
But the attitude is like what you're talking about today. You have this whole thing seems to be there's this like massive fear out there by ownership class that they don't truly possess it, but yet because of a legal construct they own it, at least temporarily. And it's like the oil companies supporting this documentation stuff. It's like they're fighting to maintain a value system which maybe is starting to become increasingly invalid. And I'm not saying that. I'm probably not saying it very right there.
No, John, you are. I was very, very interested when you began about a theme, because I'm really curious as to the theme that you see taking shape, because I'm not sure that it was one that I was not sure going in that it was one that I have. But the point that you just made is indeed the issue. I think that we are at the point where major change is about to happen in terms of what people believe and what people no longer believe. And I think you're right. What those you refer to as the ownership class, I think you're right. I think they recognize that this whole business is coming to a head. It may be taking a while, but and you're right. When you link the Greek debt crisis to this, you can begin to see that the rules of the game are becoming clearer and clearer to more people, and that means that people are beginning to see through them, if you will. I'm not implying that the whole thing is a sham. The whole thing is a lie or a fraud. I'm not going to say that. But I think there's no question that there are weaknesses here, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of them. And those that have been able to hide behind these arguments without substance for so long are beginning to recognize that Toto, the little dog, has pulled the curtain back a little bit, and Oz is becoming more and more visible to more and more people, if that makes sense.
Well, it's like the Greek situation. Goldman Sachs, you went into a little bit about it last week. Goldman Sachs fronts this money to Greece.
Right.
Now, Goldman Sachs is a private bank, but right. they have ties into the Federal Reserve, stuff like that. But things like the Federal the ECB, the European Central Bank. They have, and this is kind of where I wanted to try to, where I was a little, not so much confused, but I was hoping for a little bit more expansion maybe last week, and maybe I missed it.
Okay.
But these banks, the central banks, they create debt.
Right.
By assuming a piece of paper, a contract, or a mortgage, or a treasury bill printed off by a government, or a private company that's valued at X number of dollars. But they then in turn can create this. They basically just write numbers in a computer to cover it. And what essentially happened in the Greek situation is, a lot of the Greek debt was held by private banks, and then the European Central Bank came in and just created money out of nothing and absorbed all. Basically, as one person one time said, they privatized the profits and they socialized the downside.
Yes. Yes, I understand exactly what you're saying, and John, I think you're correct. And let me just add to what you've said, that Robert Reich, in his piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, included a statement in there that representatives from the Bank of Bank of London acknowledged that this was in effect money being created out of thin air, and as you say, central banks have been doing this. The implication that the so-called, and I'm just using this term because you did, the implication that the ownership class has been suggesting is that while money created out of thin air by central banks would be susceptible to inflation, the implication they're suggesting is that money created by private banks would not. When the fact of the matter is, the Bank of England acknowledged that private banks creating this kind of money are as much creating currency out of thin air as it would be if they were issued by the private banks. But
that is true. Any national chartered bank in the United States, for instance, has that ability. They
Right.
can, you go in with a mortgage contract that says, I want to buy a house.
Right.
The bank's your credit rating, yada, yada, yada. And if they agree to it, then they only really, and this is part of where it's part of where the thrust of my conversation is coming from is that not just in banking, but also in things like oil and gas, things like that.
Right. Right.
When they get big enough, they become banks themselves.
Exactly. Exactly. And what you do is you convert things into commodities with a market value. And what's happening, what I see happening, and again, this is just, and I'm not as conversant on this as I wish I was. But what I see happening is that many of our, and I say this, positively, many of our most valuable assets, our gas, our water, our timber, our air, are being transferred or transposed into commodities, and they're being made available on the market for sale. And what we've traditionally defined as the commons is effectively being lost because governments are letting this happen. And in a sense, what that means is that that these private banks are in effect creating wealth out of nowhere with assets that they ought not to have access to, but they are getting it. And I think they've been able to perpetrate this idea that if you turn it over to the private sector can do it more efficiently and more effectively than can the public sector. And I think that's part of the myth that is surfacing, that's becoming a little bit better understood, I believe.
Yeah, to kind of wrap this up a little bit so don't take up too much of your time.
Oh, no, you're doing fine. Don't worry about it.
Abraham Lincoln, in the early part of the Civil War, and correct me if I'm wrong here, he actually directed the Treasury Department to create a thing called a greenback.
Yes.
And actually use the Treasury. And from what, and this is part of where I'm having a little bit of, both a little irritation and a little anger, because I'm gathering that in the course of the creation of the Fed and stuff, the government essentially transferred its ability to create money, which is given to it by the Constitution, over to the private sector.
To the private sector, yes. I agree with you.
And I think that's where I think so much of these problems are coming from, because now, now I'll kind of dovetail it back into what you're talking about today, is the private sector has a vested interest in lying and deceit to the public, because the greatest fear that they have is that the public will use the one power we have left, the power of the vote, to take away their wealth.
Yes.
And, and with that, I think we've made a little progress, and I'll let you go and let you dive back into
John, you've made the progress, my friend. Thank you so very, very much. I think what you've said, as far as I can say, is right on, and I think you've added a lot to the conversation, because you're right. I think that as more and more of this is revealed and more people begin to understand some of the things that you've said, I think the private sector, the ownership class, to use your term, are becoming more and more aware that it's becoming more and more difficult to pull this off, because the ignorance of the general public isn't quite as much as ignorant as it was before, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and I think that's a positive.
Yeah, it's a positive, but it also, it sets up the stage of a tremendous amount of unrest, because you've heard it many times before. The greatest, a poor person can risk a lot because he has little to lose. Exactly. But a rich person is going to be very, very interested. It's almost statistical that if you're rich, you're rolling dice. You would say, if I've got a rich guy, I can roll the dice and say, he's got a 75% chance of being Republican, because conservative, because they don't want it to change, because the rules that exist today make them rich and allow them to stay rich. But
that's right.
But
because I think you're right. The long-term implications of this is, with more knowledge comes pressure for change, and that really frightens people who have a vested interest in not allowing change to happen.
Yes, because remember the flagship example of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was really hard on rich people.
Yeah.
And that's just how it works. Anywho, let's conversation.
John, can I ask you, before you go, can I ask you a question?
You may indeed.
Do you think that, as a general rule, do you think that our educators, our education system, as it were, do you think we've dropped the ball in terms of educating the general public enough about this stuff? In other words, do you think, I've had a problem. I mean, I've been in this game over 50 years, and I'm only now becoming a little bit more comfortable with how all this stuff works. And I'm getting angry about it, because I keep saying somebody should have ran this by me 40 years ago.
Well, Dr. O'Brien, if I were to be cold, cruel, mean, and say what I normally think, no, we didn't drop the ball. The ball was stolen from us.
Okay.
The ownership class in this country, you see it with Scott Walker and the crap he pulls off in Wisconsin. They don't want an educated population.
Right.
The internet, for all of its fantastic information, we have by and large, and I'm being a little bit expansive here, but we have almost the sum total of human knowledge at our disposal, but it's buried under so much conspiracy theories and what Kim Kardashian's glistening butt looks like and all that stuff, that, to dig it up and then be able to figure out what's true and what's not true, the average person, even if they had the inclination, they couldn't do it.
Yeah, I understand.
They don't have the tools.
I mean, everybody talked about the revolutions that were going to happen as a result of the Internet. But the fact of the matter is people have had library cards for generations, and it didn't really make a substantial change because nobody used them. And I think you're pointing out the same thing with the Internet.
Yeah, it's people are inherently, and I'm going to use the term wrong, but they are inherently conservative.
Yes.
They survive today. They have a job today. Their kids have a pair of shoes. Things are okay today. Mm-hmm. And they're so trying to worry about today that they don't necessarily realize that, by the time that the disaster hits, the makings of the disaster have been going on for years.
Right.
They're not going to know it. They're not going to know it, not going to see it, and it's going to crash and burn around it. But by that time, it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah.
And your education, I was the last in my area. I graduated around 1982.
Mm-hmm.
My exposure, for instance, to computer skills was like a 3-month course on Fortran. And if anybody knows anything about computers, which I don't, and that's only the name that stuck in my head, that stuff was antique when I graduated.
Uh-huh.
This thing's gone so far beyond how money works.
Yeah.
Bob Kincaid and I have occasionally talked about this. Most people don't even understand that money is not a piece of gold that somebody hammered through a computer screen.
Right.
They're just numbers on a computer.
Right.
If somebody says the country's broke, it's not. They say we owe money to China. We don't owe any money to China. The only money is whatever, nobody understands how the economy works. Nobody understands how international finance works. Greek situation. They all hear the same things over and over again because there is a vested interest, and this ties back to your conversation today. These, when you privatize commons, when you privatize production, you create a class of people who have a complete and utter vested interest.
Right.
The climate change issue.
Right. And John, that's where I really am thinking that we need to go, because I think the founder, James Madison made that very clear. I mean, the only way that you can expect in the abstract the republic to work and for the public interest to get priority attention is to find ways to eliminate, to siphon off or sift out self-interest as much as possible. And what we're seeing now is that this idea that we can trust the property class or whatever because they have a vested interest in doing the right thing, they also have a vested interest in getting more and more and more and more. So in reality, self-interest is never satisfied. It's got to be regulated and it's got to be controlled.
Well, see, there you just talked the bad words. The ownership class does not like regulation. Regulation limits. It constrains their ability to.
Right.
You hear them all the time talk about the sanctity of the contract.
Right. And the way they sell this is by suggesting that regulation violates freedom. And people assume freedom is the right to do what you want and no government has the right to come in and tell me I can't do something. And as long as people believe that, these people are home free.
Well, I can tell you right now, the freest people on earth are living in Somalia right now, and I bet you $1 they would give up a good chunk of that freedom in a minute.
Yeah, I agree with you. And of course the ideal would be maximum freedom within a managed, well-regulated environment where the priorities of the bulk of the people were always the priorities. And everything else was to serve that need. That's the ideal. How you get there is another issue. But
exactly.
John, thank you so much. Thank you, John.
Oh, no trouble at all. No trouble at all.
I appreciate it. Wonderful call. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks again. That was John calling from somewhere on the road out in the western part of the United States, and what a call. I mean, it's so insightful and so on target and so informative as a way to bring all of this stuff together and begin to make some sense out of it. I believe John hit the nail on the head. I believe that the issue here is understanding. And what John mentioned about the internet and about the fact that we really have, John said most, and I think that's probably correct. Most of the world's accumulated knowledge accessible to us if we know how to access it and we know how to handle it. And the fact of the matter is, there are people whose interest is to keep the rest of us from knowing. And I think the challenge, and I believe this is the challenge of the Virtual Center, the whole idea of the program, is based on the assumption that in order for the Republic to really function the way the founders envisioned a Republic functioning, does require an educated citizenry. I believe that all of us need to understand what's going on. And I think this old idea of educating the few to know what's going on and manipulating the many to the point that all they can do is go along with what the few tell them to do, I think this is driving the nation and its future into the ground. And I really believe that we are in the process of peeling that grape. I think more and more it's becoming clear that ignorance is very dangerous, and that all of us have a vested interest, have something to be gained by working harder in order to understand some of the circumstances and some of the situations within which we live. We've just passed the top of the hour. It's just gone 2 p.m. in the East. And so we have one more full hour to go here on the Virtual Center. I want to thank John so very much for that call. I want to invite you to share your thoughts with us as well. Again, the phone number, the one that John used, area code 304-663-4676. We have been looking at the documents, and of course, I think it's really interesting. It fits right into the comments that John made. It's really interesting that the only reason we know about these documents is because they surfaced in a Freedom of Information suits. These are documents that the industry, the fossil fuel industry, did not want made public because they reveal the degree, the level of hypocrisy that is existing surrounding this issue of climate change. And all the emphasis that that John just talked about in terms of what he called the ownership class, the private sector. The whole idea of the private sector being able to do things more efficiently and more effectively than the public sector has been part of the campaign by the private sector to minimize and emasculate the ability of the public sector to govern. I think that's what the controversy in Washington, the dysfunction that exists because of the polarization within our two parties in Congress. I think what we're experiencing is the inability of government to lead because of the disagreements and differences of opinion on some of these major issues. I think that these documents, the fact that they had to be uncovered through the courts, because those who sat on them had a vested interest in them not being made public. Again, there's no substitute. I can talk for days about the implications and the ramifications of what these documents say. But when you go to the sources themselves, you read the memos, you read the language that was written in these memos, which in theory were never going to see the light of day, then you begin to understand better what it is, I think, that's going on. What, if I were to, not be misinterpreted here, I would say you get a better idea of what we're up against. And what I mean by that is what those who seek to know are up against in trying to find out. We began to look at these issues yesterday with this massive media campaign and the $5 million funding of a climate data center whose purpose is to put out and put in the hands of the media and the general public and our education systems and all the rest of it contrarian information to what hard science was telling us about the climate, about damage to the planet, and about the extent to which human behavior itself was causing that damage. Obviously, there's a concerted effort, a campaign, a well-financed campaign to counter the realities of that truth. And I think when we look at these documents and we look at the substance of what's in them, we can begin to appreciate how serious this is. And then as John made the connection, and I never made it, but John made it, when you look at the Greek situation, and you look at some of the information and materials that drove that particular situation, you can begin to see the influence of the private sector in that situation as well. If indeed international decision making is moving more and more into the hands of private interest, then it seems to me that the traditional idea of government accountability is in question. Because what the Greek situation reveals to us is that what the Greek government and its people want in this situation carries very little weight. We saw a vote of 61% in a referendum where 61% of the Greek people said no. But the process continued to go on as if that referendum never even took place. And so the question, it seems to me, that all of us need to confront is that are we reaching a situation where international finance is calling the shots, not governments, not finance ministers in individual governments, but international creditors and financiers? If that is indeed true, if that's the message that comes out of the Greek situation, then it seems to me we are confronted with the reality that the nation state as we know it has become impotent. Because even if the people collectively speak to their government carries little weight in the face of the power of these international financiers. So the question is the situation suggesting that the nation state as we know it has become inefficient, ineffective, and useless? Have we reached the point where the voice of the people has become institutionally meaningless? Because even when the people unite to speak in one voice, their voice is not loud enough or powerful enough to influence the forces that are calling the shots. So the question is, do you try to put the genie back in the bottle? Do you try to reduce the power and influence of international financiers in order to render them once again subject to the will of the governments within which they are located? Is that even possible? If it's not, then does logic suggest that what we have to do is create an international political organization with enough power to regulate the international financial institutions that seems to be governing the modern world? I would suggest to you that the voice of conservatives, and I'm thinking specifically of the piece we looked at last week by George Will, it's clear that conservatives are opposed to the European Union and are opposed to a lot of this because they fear the logic of the creation of what many people refer to as world government. The creation of institutional control over international finance. That's what conservatives fear the most. That's why to a man, that's why they've opposed for so long the United Nations. Because the United Nations always represented world government as potential. And so therefore, these folks have had a vested interest throughout its history in pointing out and exacerbating every weakness, every flaw in the United Nations operation. They've tried to do everything to weaken and render the United Nations ineffective. Because the worst thing that they fear is an effective United Nations or an effective international organization by whatever name. And that's, I think, the fear that the Greek situation has brought to the fore. I think more and more people are beginning to realize that as the ineptitude and the inability of the Greek people and the Greek government to have any influence over what happens to them any longer, it's becoming clearer and clearer to people that something else seems to be called for. And I think that's where the logic seems to be taking us. And I think that's the fear. Because under the present circumstances, it's not the people of the nations that are calling the shots. It's to use John's term, it's the ownership classes, the private sector within these nations that is calling the shots. And so it's protecting their interests that I believe conservatives have a vested interest in doing everything they can to discourage the creation of an international organization or institution with the power to rein in international finance. That's where I stand on this particular issue. I think what we're looking at when we look at these documents that surfaced under the Freedom of Information Act, which reveal the degree of hypocrisy that has existed within the fossil fuel industry, like the tobacco industry before it, we can begin to realize how powerful self-interest is in all of this. Because the bottom line is, if what the scientists are telling us is true, if we accept the fact that what they're telling us and what they're warning us about is true, if we accept the fact that modern developed society is doing serious damage to the planet, to climate, if it's hurting millions and millions of people, And it's creating degrees of inequality and inequities within the world that are so large, so huge, that civil disturbance and revolution is liable to follow if something doesn't happen. If all of this is indeed what's happening, and if it is indeed true that that's what the scientists are telling us, then a conscious campaign of misinformation and disinformation in order to hide that from the general public, to me at least, is unconscionable. It's beyond obscene. It's beyond unethical. It's out and out immoral. That's what I think we need to draw from looking at these documents. And I've got 3 additional documents within this group, these so-called dossiers of deceit, of the climate deceptions dossiers is the technical word that you would look at on the internet. And the one that we began to look at yesterday, the one that particularly strikes me, is the one related directly to coal, because of where I am. And coal is so much a part of the world around me and has been for the last 23, 24 years of my life. So even though this particular example began and ended all within the same calendar year of 1991, the documents themselves didn't surface until 2009. So now we look at them and we can begin to appreciate the degree of misinformation, disinformation, deception that has occurred since that time. And therefore, we begin to look askance at some of the things that are happening now, because this campaign is not over. It would be wonderful if we could say that while all of this went on for the last 25 to 30 years, the fact of the matter is now everybody's on the same page, everybody agrees what the truth is, everybody's willing to take what the scientists are saying seriously. And we have turned the corner, and now we're going to begin to make the kind of moves we need to make in order to undo some of the damage we've already done, and in order to make sure that additional damage doesn't happen. That would be wonderful. But these documents indicate that as recently as 2014, as recently as last year, major corporations like ExxonMobil, for example, were continuing this campaign of deception and confusion of the general public. We're continuing to influence our education system. We're continuing to establish influence over the way we teach science to our young people. Even though the science is becoming more and more specific, more and more legitimately accepted, the fact of the matter is the campaign of deception continues. So strong is the self-interest associated with this. And if you want evidence that we haven't really turned the corner on this, we haven't really crossed the finish line, just look at the negative campaign against the Pope's encyclical from a little more than a month ago. And it's very obvious that the private sector, so to speak, took a very, very strong position against what the Pope was saying, especially the Pope's position that the moral question had to become part of decision-making in modern international commerce, in modern global capitalism. Because one of the strategies that has been employed by the private sector throughout this whole thing is an effort to keep separate the moral and ethical issues from the bottom line issues of economic development, growth, markets, currency, commerce, credit, international finance. The assumption is that those are all secular issues that have nothing in common with ethics and morality. The Pope's position in his encyclical has been, yes, indeed, they do have a connection, and we better start making it, because if we don't, we're going to destroy this planet. And to watch the private sector deal with the realities of the Pope's encyclical and do whatever they can to discredit the Pope as scientist, the Pope as leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope as an influential voice for humanity throughout the world. All of these positions, to one degree or another, have been taken on by the private sector. Francis is really creating a problem, however, for many, because people are so positive toward him. People genuinely believe that he's genuine, that his concern for mankind is genuine, that his concern for humanity is genuine, that his concern about the planet and about what we're doing to the environment is genuine. And if you believe he's genuine, then you're going to take what he says seriously. And if we take what he says seriously, the private sector is in trouble. So I believe that where we are right now is critically important. And that's why I think that these documents, even though some of them are 10, 15, even 20 years in the past, are so relevant, because they document the validity of the campaign of deception that has been driving this issue since that time. We began to look yesterday at Deception Dossier number 5, the creation in 1991 of an organization called Information Council on the Environment, ICE, I-C-E, which is principally funded by coal interests. This particular dossier, on its final page, lists some of the major companies that were involved in this particular effort. One of them was Peabody Holding Company, Peabody Energy, which is one of the largest coal producers in the country. Another, Ohio Valley Coal Company, a subsidiary of Murray Energy. Pittsburgh and Midway Coal Mining, a subsidiary of Chevron. Island Creek Coal Company, a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum. So I think one thing that becomes clear is we're really creating a problem if we make too much of the distinction between the difference between coal and oil. Because basically what we're talking about here is common interest, common management, and in many cases, common self-interest. According to this dossier, the internal documents leaked about ICE reveal a strategy which is, first, a plan to and this is a quote from the document, a plan to reposition global warming as theory, not fact. One of the objectives of the Information Council on the Environment, this educational effort on the part of Big Coal, is to reposition global warming as theory and not fact. By repositioning it, what that means is there is a campaign underway to convince the people that what they think is fact is in fact just theory, and therefore can be questioned by an alternate theory. And the second element of this plan is to use a spokesman from the scientific community in order to make the case, recognizing that technical sources receive the highest overall credibility ratings, unquote. In other words, we've got to get people with reputable scientific reputations to do our bidding. Because when they have the qualifications and they have those letters after their name, for example, people tend to listen to them as experts. As we mentioned yesterday, ICE's advertising campaign was funded to the tune of $500,000, $500,000, to put out advertising. And one of them that we looked at yesterday, one of the print advertisements that the ICE campaign, I got to be careful not to say ISIS, I can't help that the ICE campaign produced showed a sailing ship about to drop off the edge of a flat world. And the headline read, "Some say the earth is warming, some also said the earth was flat," unquote. And then we also shared yesterday the advertisement from the Rush Limbaugh program in 1991 put together by ICE, pointing out that the Minneapolis has actually gotten colder, as has Albany, New York. In other words, looking at snowfall and winter temperatures and emphasizing the severity of them in order to counter the argument that global warming is occurring. And we've all heard this, it seems to me. The fact of the matter is, these documents indicate that even those involved in the ICE campaign itself acknowledged that as they collect more and more evidence on climate, quote, "it certainly did not show cooling," unquote. In other words, they knew that the evidence was indicating that warming of the planet was indeed happening. Yet at the same time, they continued to engage in their campaign of disinformation to sell the idea to the general public that the planet was not warming. This particular quotation is one that in the margins of the printed copy I wrote "wow" beside it because I think this is very significant. A particular target of the ICE campaign was younger, lower-income women. And this is what the internal document says about targeting this advertising campaign to younger, low-income women. And this is a quote: "These women are more receptive than other audience segments to factual information concerning the evidence for global warming. They are likely to be green consumers, to believe the earth is warming, and to think the problem is serious. However, they are also likely to soften their support for federal legislation after hearing new information on global warming." In other words, because of their priorities and their inclinations, they are the first to buy into this idea of global warming, but they are also the most receptive to contrary or contrarian information which argues just the opposite of global warming. And let me read this from the second page of this dossier. Specifically, the results of this study by ICE point toward two possible target audiences. We've already mentioned one. Here's the other. One possible target audience includes those who are most receptive to messages describing the motivations and vested interests of people currently making pronouncements on global warming. For example, the statement that some members of the media scare the public about global warming to increase their audience and their influence. In other words, one focus of this advertising campaign funded by Big Coal is to aim at those people who are most likely to believe that the people screaming the loudest about global warming are media personalities who are principally interested in building audience. Basically, those people who believe that are easier to convince that the people bringing them the news of global warming have their own agenda. And therefore, you can't take seriously what they're saying. People, this is again verbatim from the document, people who respond most favorably to such statements are older, less educated males from large households who are not typically active information seekers and are not likely to be green consumers. The target audience for this campaign are older men from large families who do not typically become information seekers. They aren't big advocates or supporters of education. They don't do research. They are inclined to believe what they're told. They are inclined to believe what they hear. Therefore, we're putting up $500,000 to make sure that what they hear is our position, not the other position. And then the second group, the second target group of the campaign, is the one mentioned previously, namely younger, lower-income women. They are likely to be green consumers to believe that the earth is warming, but they are also likely to soften their support for federal legislation once they get contrary information. ICE was formed in 1991. It was linked to coal, obviously, but it was linked generally to the fossil fuel companies and trade associations generally, including major electric utilities. A target of this campaign, this ICE campaign, was public utilities, the electric companies. Because the electric companies could link the campaign about climate to the increased rates that efforts to minimize or reduce carbon emissions would cause in electric rates. So consequently, organizations like Edison Electric Institute, the Western Fuels Association, and the National Coal Association become heavily involved in the creation and funding of ICE. One of the vice presidents of the ICE campaign was Fred Palmer. At that time, he was Chief Executive Officer, CEO of Western Fuels. And now, in 2009, when this document first surfaced in the New York Times, he is Senior Vice President at Peabody Energy. The president of Peabody Energy, Peter Lilly, who's a local guy, I've heard him speak, he's a West Virginian, in 2010 was President and Chief Operating Officer of Peabody Holding and served as well on the National Coal Association's Board of Directors. This ICE campaign, which this dossier described as a, quote, bald attempt to mislead the public about climate science, was short-lived. It began in 1991 and it ended in 1991. And here's the story behind the demise. ICE created a science advisory panel of 3 well-known climate deniers, contrarians. Their names: Robert Balling, Patrick Michaels, Sherwood Idso, IDSO. These 3 scientists, however, admitted to the New York Times, quote, that the salient element in 2 of ICE's ads, that some areas might be in fact cooling, did not contradict the theory of global warming. In other words, even these deniers, these contrarians, these experts that ICE depended on, acknowledged that the evidence being brought forth about the temperatures in Minneapolis and Albany and the rest of it really didn't contradict the realities of global warming. Once documents showing the misleading intent of the ICE campaign surfaced, Balling and Michaels, 2 of the 3 members of the advisory committee, disengaged from ISIS. They quit. The third one was Patrick Michaels. And Michaels wrote the following in an internal memo. With only 3 names on the mailing list, people would identify him as the source of all this information, while he was not, in fact, the author, and that the size of the science advisory panel was so small that it made the position appear scientifically unpopular. In a 1999 memo, PBD Energy's Fred Palmer made the point that he really wishes ICE had not been forced to disband 8 years earlier in 1991. Fred Palmer wrote, "It is unfortunate that ICE did not go forward, since the campaign provoked a dramatic turnaround in how people viewed the issue of global warming," unquote. In other words, we were winning. But because too much of what we were doing and what we were about became public, we had to disband. How revealing. How revealing. Documents that indicate a campaign directed towards people who aren't well enough educated to be able to distinguish between fact and opinion. How revealing. A campaign targeted to poor women whose husbands would probably be most likely working in the fossil fuel industry. It would be their way of life that would be threatened. Therefore, you aim your campaign of education, in quotes, at these particular groups of people. These are not educated people. They aren't people that go to the library or to the internet in order to get evidence before they take a position. They are people influenced. They are people who gravitate to opinions that they tend to agree with. They are people who get all of their news from Fox, for example, whose day, every day of every week begins with Fox and Friends. And I'm using that as an example because what we're suggesting here is the nature of the people that were the target of this particular PR campaign funded by Cole. That occurred and ended in 1991. A second dossier in this group is dossier number 7. And it speaks to the creation in 1995, 4 years after ICE disappeared, of a group called the Global Climate Coalition. And in 1995, this Global Climate Coalition put together a document which they called a primer entitled Predicting Future Climate Change, a primer. In other words, this organization developed or published a document, a 17-page document that was designed to be in the hands of all those people who would defend the fossil fuel industry. This primer was published in 1995. It came to light in 2009 when it was leaked to the New York Times. It was written by a team led by Leonard S. Bernstein, not Leonard Bernstein, the musician. This Leonard Bernstein was a chemical engineer, a climate expert at Mobil Corporation. And he was the major architect of this primer in the group he represented, entitled the Global Climate Coalition. It presented itself as an umbrella trade association to coordinate business participation in the international debate on global climate change. But its real purpose, according to this dossier, was to oppose mandatory reductions in carbon emissions. Its members included BP, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, and other fossil fuel companies. The leaked primer on climate change science demonstrates beyond a doubt that the fossil fuel industry in 1995 was, quote, well aware of the scientific understanding of climate change, even as it continued to sow doubt about the science and block climate action. In fact, the primer itself stated, quote, the scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases, such as CO2, on climate is well established and cannot be denied, unquote. This is in the primer, written in 1995, authored by Leonard S. Bernstein. But there's more. One section of the primer was deleted before it was approved for printing. And what was excised, what was eliminated from the document before it went to the printer, was a statement that in fact the contrarian science, the science that we have hired and employed to debunk existing science, was not valid. That in effect, those that the industry hired to challenge hard science were coming up with evidence that really wasn't evidence at all. It was fallacious. This particular piece of the primer, which was excised, which was deleted before it was published, admitted, quote, that these contrarian theories fail to offer convincing arguments against the conventional model of greenhouse gas emissions induced climate change, unquote. That document was a blatant admission, that line in the primer was an admission that the evidence we've brought forth to counter what the scientists are telling us is not worth the paper it's printed on. That admission was deleted from the primer before it was published. But the fact of the matter is, the primer acknowledged that there's too much evidence on the validity of what climate science is telling us to refute. And specifically, they go into the issue of contrarians trying to prove that variations in solar energy were responsible for what warming there seemed to be in the climate. The fact of the matter is that science doesn't hold up. And let me share with you. I'm trying to get through because I know we're running out of time. We've got less than 15 minutes to go in our program today. This is from the dossier. The clear refutation of the solar variability argument in the memo, in the primer, is especially noteworthy given the continued funding by ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests of Dr. Willie Soon for more than 2 decades. He was funded at the Smithsonian Institute with money coming from ExxonMobil. His job was to prove solar variability was responsible for global warming. And here's this primer that comes out in 1995, which says that the evidence we're getting on solar variability doesn't hold up. Finally, in 2002, the Global Coalition disbanded. It went out of business. And as a justification for going out of business, it argued that, quote, we have served our purpose by contributing to a new national approach to global warming, and that we have achieved what we wanted to accomplish with the Kyoto Protocol being rejected by the Bush administration. So when President Bush's administration withdrew its support for the Kyoto Agreement, this global coalition disbanded, claiming that it was successful, that it had been successful in defeating Kyoto. And then there's further evidence in this dossier, which I won't go into now because we're getting close to the end of our program. But there's additional evidence here that many of the original members of this coalition were bailing out and jumping ship. ExxonMobil itself began to back off some of the positions being taken. Chevron, BP began to bail out of this particular organization. And with less than 10 minutes to go in our program, just about 8 minutes left, let me share with you dossier number 6, which is about the campaign of deception undertaken by the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is funded to a large extent by Koch Industries and by ExxonMobil. In 2014, last year, the American Legislative Exchange Council held its annual meeting in Dallas. Its featured presentation, the keynote speaker, was Joseph Bast, B-A-S-T, president of the Heartland Institute. Heartland has a long history of attacking science. Heartland is best known for a billboard linking those who worry about climate change to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. The billboard that the Heartland Institute supported featured a headshot of a very disheveled Ted Kaczynski with the following caption: "I still believe in global warming, do you?" This was 2014 that this presentation by Joseph Bast was delivered to the annual conference of the American Legislative Exchange Council. In his presentation, Bast claimed, quote, "There is no scientific consensus on the human role in climate change," unquote. Also, in one of his slides, he stated, quote, "The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change," which is the international organization funded by the United Nations of scientists. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Bast said, "a project of the United Nations, is not a credible source of science or economics." He said this in his presentation to the ALEC convention last year in 2014. At the same conference, Dallas 2014, one of the presentations was delivered by David Rothbard. David Rothbard was a member of the Global Climate Science Communications team put together in 1998 by the American Petroleum Institute. What does this suggest? It suggests that the campaign of deception and misinformation is not over. Many of these documents are 5, 10, 15 years old, but that doesn't mean that the information they give us is outdated. The campaign hasn't stopped. The misinformation and confusion and doubt, which is the focus of this entire effort, continues to go on. In this dossier, looking at Rothbard's presentation to the 2014 American Legislative Exchange Council conference in Dallas, the dossier reports the following. Rothbard's presentation began with the outright falsehood, quote, "that the scientific reality is that on virtually every claim from A to Z, the claims of the promoters of man-made climate fears are falling short, are going in the opposite direction," he reported. Sponsors of the ALEC convention, a conference in 2014, included Chevron, ExxonMobil, Peabody Energy. I think the relevant issue here is the involvement of ALEC and the fact that this conference occurred within the last year. This campaign is not over. It is still underway. There is an educational challenge that all of us need to confront. Let me share with you just one point. In September of 2014, last September, Google made a very public defection from ALEC. On National Public Radio's Diane Rehm show on NPR, Google's executive chairman, Eric Schmidt, said that his company, Google, had decided that funding ALEC was a mistake. Google, he said, has a very strong view that we should make decisions in politics based on facts. And the facts of climate change are not in question anymore. Everyone understands climate change is occurring, and the people who oppose it are really hurting our children and our grandchildren and making the world a much worse place. And so we should not be aligned with such people. They are just literally lying. So said Eric Schmidt, Google's executive chairman. And at that point, in September of 2014, Google disengaged from funding the American Legislative Exchange Council. Since that time, ConocoPhillips has disengaged from ALEC, Occidental Petroleum, and most recently BP has disengaged from ALEC. However, ExxonMobil and Koch Industries continue to fund the ALEC effort. ExxonMobil donated $1.6 million to ALEC over the last decade. Koch Industries gave $747,000 between 2007 and 2012. The evidence is irrefutable. The campaign of deception is real. And when major corporations like Google are acknowledging that fact, it seems to me that all of us need to pay attention. As we move towards the end of our program today here at the Virtual Center, we've got less than 3 minutes to go in our program, in our time together today. Let me just make an observation or two. It seems to me that more than anything else, what this situation speaks to, what we witness in all of these documents, is the absence of government oversight and regulation. What we see in these documents and the pronouncements of these organizations, with information that they refer to as evidence, but the question is, even their supporters themselves acknowledge that this isn't real evidence. Google said it's lying. But the fact of the matter is, how are they able to get away with this? In large part, they are able to get away with this because they have been very successful in cutting government's regulatory efforts off at the knees. Part of their campaign is to promote the idea of private sector freedom and to basically suggest that jobs, economic growth, and all of the good things in life are sacrificed if government's presence and government's role in economic management and economic oversight is too pronounced. It seems to me what we're forced to confront, and I'd like to maybe take this on in more detail tomorrow. It seems to me that what we're forced to confront is the reality of what the founders told us more than 2 centuries ago. And that is that the attraction of self-interest is so overpowering and so strong that somehow you have to find a way to disengage government from self-interest. You've got to find a way to wean government of those whose primary interest is self-interest. And as we struggle to understand more and more about the nature of our political structure, as we struggle to understand the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, which is the basis of those Federalist Papers, we need to focus more and more on what the founders are telling us about the dangers of self-interest, because what we see here is that self-interest, unregulated, constitutes private power. It's plutocracy. It's alien to the republic. And with that, it seems to me, I think we need to bring today's program to an end. We have reached the top of the hour. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow at our regular time. Thank you.